Hey everyone, hope you're having an amazing day. Today we're diving into a dramatic story where a powerful CEO is suddenly forced into a family-arranged marriage. But everything changes when he stands up at the dinner table and reveals that he already has someone he truly loves. What secret does he know about Trin? And how will his family react after his shocking rejection? Stay tuned because this story is full of tension, hidden truths, and emotional twists you won't want to miss. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next video. A formal atmosphere filled the private dining room of the luxury restaurant. Warm golden lights reflected softly against the crystal glasses on the table, while slow piano music played quietly in the background. Sitting across from each other were two middle-aged men who hadn't shared a long conversation like this in years. Mr. Quan slowly lifted his cup of tea and smiled at his old friend. It's been a long time since we sat down together like this. Uncle Tung chuckled softly, his eyes filled with nostalgia. You're right. Feels like just yesterday we were still young and struggling to build our careers, and now our children are all grown up. The two men laughed warmly, but beneath those smiles was a purpose that had already been carefully planned. This wasn't just a reunion between old friends. Tonight was about something much bigger. Mr. Quan placed his teacup down gently before speaking in a calmer, more serious tone. The thing we talked about on the phone, I think we should officially discuss it today. Uncle Tung nodded immediately. I was thinking the same thing. Honestly, I've always respected your family. If the two kids could become closer, I think that would be wonderful. For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Both men exchanged hopeful looks, silently understanding each other without needing to say much more. Their friendship had lasted for decades, and now they hoped that bond could continue through the next generation. Mr. Quan sighed lightly. Quan is already 30 now. All he ever thinks about is work. Sometimes I worry he'll never make time for his personal life. He paused before continuing. As parents, at the end of the day, we just want our children to settle down and have someone by their side. Uncle Tung smiled in agreement. Trin is exactly the same. She spent years studying abroad and only recently came back home. She's talented, independent, but honestly, I'm afraid she's gotten too used to being alone. His eyes drifted toward the entrance as he spoke, the unmistakable concern of a father showing on his face. I just hope she finds someone mature enough to take care of her. Mr. Quan smiled knowingly. I think Quan and Trin would suit each other well. The two men exchanged another satisfied look. In their minds, this arrangement seemed almost perfect. The families were close. Their backgrounds matched. Both children were successful and well-educated. Everything seemed naturally aligned. A few moments later, the private room door slowly opened. A young woman stepped inside wearing an elegant cream-colored dress. Her long hair was tied neatly behind her shoulders, and her delicate makeup only highlighted her graceful appearance. Uncle Tung immediately smiled proudly. Trin, come in. Trin politely bowed her head. Hello, Uncle. Mr. Quan looked at her carefully before nodding in approval. You're beautiful. You really resemble your mother when she was younger. Trin smiled modestly. You're too kind. Uncle Tung couldn't hide the pride in his voice. She just completed her studies overseas. She only returned to Vietnam recently. Mr. Quan nodded repeatedly. That's impressive. It's rare to see someone both beautiful and talented these days. Just then, the door opened again. Quan walked into the room. He wore a dark dress shirt with simple styling, but his calm and mature aura immediately stood out. Though there was visible exhaustion on his face from a long business trip, he still carried the composed presence of someone used to leading others. Mr. Quan immediately called out, Quan, come sit down. Quan greeted everyone politely. Hello, Uncle. Uncle Tung laughed warmly. It's been years since I last saw you. I heard you're running the company now. Quan nodded slightly. Just work responsibilities, Uncle. Mr. Quan looked at his son with visible pride. He's been obsessed with work since he was young, always at the office. Then he turned toward Trin. This is Trin, Uncle Tung's daughter. I think you two should get to know each other better. Trin smiled first. I've heard a lot about you already. Quan gave a polite nod. It's nice to meet you. The dinner quickly became livelier as the two fathers reminisced about old memories together. They talked about the difficult years when they first started their businesses, the struggles they overcame side by side, and how they had supported each other through countless hardships. The longer they talked, the more natural this arrangement seemed to them. At one point, Uncle Tung looked directly at Quan and spoke with a meaningful smile. Your father and I have known each other since we were young, with nothing in our hands. If our families become relatives one day, that would truly make me happy. Mr. Quan immediately laughed in agreement. That's right. We're getting older now. All we want is to see our children living stable and happy lives. Their words sounded casual, but every sentence carried invisible pressure, and Quan could feel it clearly. He remained silent for a few seconds, eyes lowering toward the glass in front of him. At that moment, only one person appeared in his mind, Tieu, the girl who had stayed beside him during his hardest days. The only person who could calm him down after endless meetings, business pressure, and exhausting work trips. He had planned to tell his family about her eventually. He just never expected things to move this fast. Across the table, Trin maintained her elegant smile. She was beautiful, intelligent, and incredibly good at social interactions. To anyone looking from the outside, she would seem like the perfect daughter-in-law. But Quan knew things others didn't. Behind her graceful appearance were secrets hidden carefully beneath the surface. Through business connections, Quan had accidentally learned several things about Trin during her years abroad. Complicated relationships, situations where she manipulated people to achieve her goals. Because of that, despite barely knowing her personally, Quan had always kept his distance. Meanwhile, dinner continued pleasantly around him. The two fathers occasionally tried to create opportunities for Quan and Trin to talk. Quan, you should bring Trin to visit your company sometime. She just came back to Vietnam. She probably doesn't know many people yet. Young people should spend more time together. Quan simply smiled politely. Maybe when work becomes less busy. His answers were respectful, careful enough not to embarrass anyone, but distant enough to avoid encouraging false hope. Trin seemed to notice it too. She looked at him quietly for a second before asking softly, "Are you always this busy?" Quan nodded calmly. The company has several important projects right now. That sounds stressful. I'm used to it. The conversation ended there. Short, polite, cold. For just a split second, Trin's expression stiffened slightly before she quickly smiled again, as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the two fathers remained completely immersed in their excitement for the future they imagined. Quan looked at his son and joked lightly, "You really should start thinking about marriage. At your age, I already had you." Uncle Tung laughed loudly. That's true. Once a man becomes successful, he should settle down. Those words made Quan slowly tighten his hand beneath the table. He hated feeling pressured, especially when it came to love. A brief silence followed. Finally, Quan lifted his gaze and spoke calmly. "I think relationships should happen naturally." Mr. Quan's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" Quan remained composed. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but right now I want to focus on work." Uncle Tung quickly waved his hand with a light laugh to ease the tension. "There's no rush. The two of you can slowly get to know each other." Trin nodded gently as well. "He's right, Uncle. We only just met." The atmosphere softened again, but inside, Quan felt more conflicted than ever. He didn't want to disappoint his father. He also didn't want to embarrass Uncle Tung. But at the same time, he couldn't stay silent and let this misunderstanding continue growing. Dinner lasted for nearly another hour. When the final dish was served, Uncle Tung suddenly smiled and suggested, How about Quan takes Trin out somewhere after this? Maybe coffee or a walk? Mr. Quan immediately agreed. That's a good idea. Young people should spend time alone. All eyes turned toward Quan. For a few seconds, he remained silent. Then he slowly stood up. I'm sorry, but I need to return to the company. The atmosphere instantly paused. Quan continued calmly. There's still a lot of unfinished work from my business trip. I also have an important meeting tomorrow morning. Mr. Quan looked at his son as if he wanted to say something, but eventually only sighed softly. If work is important, then go ahead. Uncle Tung smiled understandingly. Of course, work comes first. Trin nodded politely. Maybe another time then. Quan looked at her briefly. I'm sorry I couldn't spend more time talking today. It's okay. He respectfully bowed his head toward the elders. Please excuse me. Then he turned and walked out of the room. The moment the door closed behind him, Quan finally released a long breath. A sense of relief immediately washed over him. But along with that relief came guilt. He knew how much his father had hoped for tonight. He also understood how sincerely the two older men wanted their families to become closer. Yet the more they pushed, the more trapped he felt. His footsteps echoed quietly through the empty hallway of the restaurant. After a few moments, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The moment the screen lit up with a familiar name, his expression softened instantly. Tieu Lac. Quan stared at the name for several seconds before finally pressing call. The phone rang briefly, then her voice came through. Hello? The moment he heard her voice, the tension inside him eased slightly. Quan leaned against the wall beside the hallway and spoke quietly. What are you doing? I just got home. Did you finish dinner? Quan stayed silent for a moment before giving a faint smile. Yeah, I just finished. Tieu Lac immediately sensed something strange in his voice. Are you tired? Quan rubbed his forehead slowly. My dad arranged a meeting for me tonight. There was silence on the other end. Then her soft voice returned carefully. You mean a blind date? Tieu Lac fell silent for several seconds after hearing those words. Even through the phone, Quan could still feel the slight shift in her breathing. A blind date? She repeated softly, almost unsure if she had heard him correctly. Quan closed his eyes briefly and leaned harder against the wall behind him. Yeah. The hallway around him remained quiet, but inside his mind, everything felt messy and exhausting. Tieu Lac tried to keep her voice calm. So, how did it go? Quan let out a short breath, almost like a bitter laugh. It wasn't really a date, more like both families already planned everything in advance. There was another brief silence. He could imagine her sitting quietly somewhere in her apartment, holding the phone tightly while trying not to overthink. Quan understood her too well. Before she could say anything else, he spoke first. I told them I wasn't interested. Her voice became quieter. You did? Yeah. Quan loosened his tie slightly before continuing. My dad and Uncle Tung want me and Trin to get married eventually. They think it would strengthen the relationship between the two families. Tieu Lac lowered her gaze unconsciously. Even though she had expected something serious, hearing the words "get married" still made her chest tighten. And what about you? She finally asked. Quan answered without hesitation. I already have someone I love. The moment he said those words, the heaviness inside him suddenly eased. On the other end of the call, Tieu Lac slowly bit her lip, trying to hide the emotions rising in her heart. But Quan wasn't finished yet. I made it clear tonight that I don't agree with this arrangement. He paused for a moment. And honestly, I don't trust Trin. That caught her attention immediately. What do you mean? Quan glanced down the empty hallway before lowering his voice. There are things about her that my dad doesn't know. He thought back to the information he had accidentally learned months ago through overseas business partners. At first, he hadn't cared much, but after tonight, every detail came back clearly in his mind. When Trin was overseas, she got involved with some people in the investment world. A few scandals happened, but they were covered up pretty quickly. Tu frowned slightly. Scandals? Quan nodded even though she couldn't see him. She's smart, very smart, but she knows how to use people to get what she wants. He spoke calmly, but there was obvious caution in his voice. I'm not saying she's a bad person, but she's definitely not someone I'd ever choose to build a future with. Tu stayed quiet, listening carefully. For some reason, hearing Quan explain everything so honestly made her feel both relieved and worried at the same time. Relieved because he had rejected the arrangement. Worried because family pressure was never something simple, especially in families like his. After a moment, she asked softly, "Was your dad upset?" Quan smiled bitterly. He tried not to show it. He slowly straightened himself and began walking toward the parking area. But I know him. He already imagined this whole future in his head before tonight even started. The sound of his footsteps echoed faintly through the underground parking garage. Tieu could picture the exhausted expression on his face without even seeing him. "You shouldn't fight with your family because of me," she whispered. Quan stopped walking immediately. "What did you just say?" Her voice became smaller. "I mean, your dad clearly wants this. Maybe you should think carefully before..." Before she could finish, Quan interrupted firmly. "Tieu, it was the first time that night his tone became serious. I called you because I wanted you to hear the truth from me directly." He unlocked his car door but didn't get inside yet. "I don't care how perfect this arrangement looks to everyone else. I'm not going to pretend to like someone when my heart already belongs to another person." Tieu lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Quan's voice softened again. "Do you really think I'd let someone else replace you that easily?" Her heartbeat quietly sped up. Back inside the private dining room, the atmosphere had completely changed after Quan left. Mr. Quan sat silently while slowly rotating the wine glass in his hand. Across from him, Uncle Tung forced a smile. "Kids these days are independent. We can't rush them too much." Mr. Quan sighed heavily. "I know my son. The more pressure I put on him, the more he'll resist." Trin remained quiet beside her father, but unlike the calm expression on her face, her thoughts were far from peaceful. She replayed the entire dinner in her mind. Quan's distant attitude, his polite but cold responses, and especially the moment he rejected the idea of spending time alone with her. No man had ever treated her that way before. Back when she studied overseas, she was always the center of attention. Wealthy businessmen, successful investors, even celebrities had pursued her. Yet tonight, Quan barely looked interested. That irritated her more than she expected. Uncle Tung suddenly turned toward his daughter. "What do you think of Quan?" Trin picked up her glass slowly before answering with a small smile. "He's different from what I expected." Mr. Quan looked at her carefully. "In a bad way?" She shook her head calmly. "No. Actually, that's what makes him interesting." At the same time, outside in the parking garage, Quan finally sat inside his car. The engine remained off. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly. Tieu voice came softly through the speaker. "You sound exhausted." Quan laughed quietly. "I am." "Then go home and rest." "I will." But instead of ending the call, he stayed silent for a moment longer. Then he suddenly spoke again. "There's something else." Tieu blinked slightly. "What is it?" Quan opened his eyes slowly. "My dad doesn't know about you yet." Her expression immediately stiffened. "Oh, I wanted to tell him after things at the company became more stable. But now," he exhaled slowly, "I think I waited too long." Tieu sat quietly on the edge of her bed. Deep down, she always knew this conversation would come eventually. The difference in their backgrounds had never been a secret. Quan came from a wealthy and influential family. Meanwhile, she had built her life quietly on her own without powerful connections or family status behind her. To people like Mr. Quan, she probably wouldn't look like the ideal match. Maybe your dad just wants what's best for you, she said carefully. Quan gave a faint smile. I know. Then don't be too hard on him. He stared through the windshield at the dim parking lights ahead. The problem is, I'm tired of everyone deciding my future for me. That sentence carried years of pressure hidden beneath it. Ever since taking over the company, every step of his life had been tied to expectations. How he should act, who he should meet, what kind of marriage would benefit the family. For the first time in years, Tiểu was the only thing in his life that felt truly real and personal, and he refused to let anyone take that away from him. Back inside the restaurant, Trin excused herself and stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city. The cool night breeze brushed against her hair as she crossed her arms thoughtfully. Her phone vibrated. One of her old friends from overseas had sent her a message. Back in Vietnam already? Found your next target yet? Trin smirked faintly before typing a short reply. Maybe. She slipped the phone back into her purse and looked out at the glowing city lights below. At first, she had only agreed to tonight's dinner because of her father, but now, Quan's rejection had unexpectedly sparked her curiosity. A man like him wasn't easy to control, and people were always more attractive when they couldn't be easily obtained. Meanwhile, Quan finally started the engine and drove out of the parking garage. The city streets at night blurred past the windows as he continued talking to Tiểu through the car speakers. What are you thinking about? He asked. She hesitated briefly before answering honestly. I'm thinking things are probably going to get harder from now on. Quan's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Maybe. And if your family keeps pressuring you, then I'll handle it. His answer came instantly. Tiểu sighed softly. You say that now, but family expectations aren't easy to fight against. Quan turned at the next intersection, his expression calm but determined. I know. Then why are you so sure? For a moment, only the sound of the road filled the silence between them. Then Quan finally answered. Because losing you would bother me more than disappointing anyone else. Tiểu froze completely. Her heart trembled quietly at his words. Quan rarely said emotional things directly, but whenever he did, every word carried weight. She lowered her gaze, unable to stop the small smile forming on her lips. Back at the restaurant, the dinner was finally ending. Mr. Quan stood up slowly and adjusted his jacket. I'm sorry if tonight felt uncomfortable. Uncle Tung immediately shook his head. Don't say that. They just need more time. Trin also smiled politely. I understand. But deep inside, she had already made a decision. She wasn't someone who gave up easily, especially not after being rejected. As the three of them walked toward the exit, Mr. Quan suddenly stopped for a moment. For some reason, Quan's earlier words kept replaying in his mind. I already have someone I love. At the time, he had ignored it, but now thinking back carefully, his son's eyes had been completely serious. Mr. Quan slowly frowned. Could Quan really already be in a relationship? And if he was, who exactly was the girl capable of making his son reject a perfect arrangement like this? Meanwhile, several streets away, Quan finally arrived outside Tiolak's apartment building. He parked the car by the sidewalk but didn't get out immediately. Are you home already? She asked softly. Yeah. Then go upstairs and sleep. Quan looked up toward the apartment windows glowing warmly above. After a brief silence, he suddenly asked, Do you want me to come see you? Tiểu blinked in surprise. At this hour? Tiểu remained deeply immersed in a tormenting pain that wrapped around her heart like an endless, suffocating fog that refused to lift no matter how hard she tried. She sat motionless in her dimly lit room, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive and isolating rather than peaceful or comforting. The emotional burden pressed down heavily on her chest, turning each breath into a slow, labored effort filled with exhaustion and quiet despair. The air in the room seemed thick and still, carrying the faint scent of familiarity mixed with the heaviness of her sorrow. Her loyal dog, Milu, lay curled up gently beside her on the bed, providing a source of warm, silent companionship through its steady breathing and calm, understanding presence. The dog's soft fur rose and fell with each peaceful breath, a small anchor in the middle of her storm. Yet despite this familiar and loving comfort being so close at hand, she found herself completely drained of energy and will, unable to reach out even a little to stroke its soft fur as she usually would during moments of sadness or loneliness. Her hand rested limply at her side, fingers barely moving, as her mind wandered endlessly through a complex maze of painful memories, lingering doubts, unresolved questions, and fragments of happier times that now felt distant and tainted. The room around her seemed smaller than usual, with shadows stretching longer across the walls as if they were mirroring the pressure and darkness building inside her heart. Time passed slowly in this state of deep vulnerability, each minute stretching out painfully as she replayed scenes from her recent experiences over and over again, feeling the heavy weight of confusion, heartbreak, and growing suspicion that refused to ease or fade away even for a moment. In the midst of this overwhelming emotional darkness that consumed her thoughts, her phone suddenly vibrated softly on the nearby table surface. A new message had arrived from an unknown number, its notification light cutting through the dimness like an unwelcome intruder. The content of the message offered to reveal the truth regarding CEO Quan and Trin, directing her to arrive alone at Cafe Song Hong at exactly 10 o'clock that night. As she picked up the phone with trembling fingers and read the words carefully, then read them again, a powerful surge of conflicting emotions washed over her entire being. Sharp, cold fear intertwined with an intense, desperate need for clarity, answers, and some form of closure. Her heart began pounding heavily in her chest as she considered the implications. She understood clearly the potential dangers hidden within such an anonymous and mysterious invitation, sensing that responding could lead her into unpredictable, risky, and possibly harmful situations. The cautious voice in her mind warned strongly and repeatedly against going, highlighting the suspicious nature of the request, the lack of any identifiable sender, and the possibility that it could all be part of a carefully laid trap designed to hurt her further. However, the accumulated pain from all the uncertainties, the sleepless nights filled with questions, and the burning desire to finally understand what had truly been happening between CEO Quan and Trin proved far stronger than her fears and rational warnings. After spending a considerable amount of time engaged in a difficult and exhausting internal battle, carefully weighing every possible outcome, imagining worst-case scenarios, and struggling with her own conflicting instincts, she ultimately made the resolute decision to proceed despite everything. She prepared herself with slow, deliberate movements, taking time to steady her nerves as best she could in her weakened state. She offered a quiet, affectionate farewell to Milu, her voice soft and filled with emotion as she gently touched the dog's head one last time, before forcing herself to step out into the night. Her footsteps carried a mixture of deep hesitation, anxiety, and a fragile thread of hope that perhaps discovering the truth might finally bring some measure of relief to her long-tormented soul. The journey toward Cafe Song Hong unfolded slowly and tensely under the cover of darkness, with the city lights passing by in a somewhat blurred sequence outside the vehicle window. Street lights created shifting patterns of light and shadow as she traveled, while her thoughts continuously drifted back to earlier moments shared with CEO Quan. The warmth of his smile that once made her feel safe, the comfort of his presence during difficult times, and the promises that now felt clouded by multiple layers of suspicion, uncertainty, and emotional pain. The city street seemed longer than usual, each turn and intersection adding to the growing knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. When she finally arrived at the cafe, the environment presented itself in a deceptively peaceful and ordinary manner that contrasted sharply with her inner turmoil. Soft background music played gently throughout the warmly lit space, mixing harmoniously with the rich, inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, sweet pastries, and subtle notes of vanilla that lingered warmly in the air. She carefully selected a seat positioned near the large window, one that provided a clear and unobstructed view of the river outside shimmering under the nightlights, and allowed her to observe the surrounding area with vigilance. Her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of hot coffee, feeling its initial warmth gradually fade away as the minutes continued to pass without any sign of the mysterious sender. 10 o'clock came and went quietly, leaving her sitting there in increasing discomfort and restlessness. She scanned every person who entered the cafe with watchful, cautious eyes and observed every shadow and movement along the street outside with heightened awareness. The prolonged waiting only intensified her inner turmoil, causing waves of doubt, fear, and second thoughts to rise higher with each passing moment. She began wondering whether this entire situation was nothing more than a calculated effort to deepen her emotional suffering at a time when she was already so incredibly fragile and vulnerable. Then, without any prior indication or warning, another message appeared on her phone screen. This new instruction told her to cross immediately to the other side of the street because the sender was already waiting there for her. Her heart began racing rapidly as she glanced out through the cafe window toward the dimly lit road across from her, trying to make out any details in the darkness. Despite the strong and almost paralyzing grip of fear that tightened around her chest, she quickly settled her bill and stepped out from the relative safety of the cafe into the open night air. The cool evening breeze brushed against her skin, creating a sharp and noticeable contrast with the intense heat of anxiety and adrenaline burning within her. Her legs carried a noticeable unsteadiness as she moved toward the curb and started crossing the street, her gaze darting repeatedly in every direction as she searched desperately for any indication or sign of the person who had drawn her to this location through such secretive and mysterious means. The road felt wider and more exposed than usual in that moment, each step requiring conscious effort as her senses remained on high alert to every sound, every shadow, and every movement around her. The relative calm of the night was suddenly and violently interrupted by the loud, aggressive roar of a car engine coming to life somewhere nearby. A black vehicle emerged swiftly from the surrounding shadows, accelerating with alarming and dangerous speed directly toward her vulnerable position in the middle of the road. In that horrifying instant, time appeared to slow down dramatically as overwhelming panic seized complete control of her body and mind. She remained frozen in place, unable to move or escape, while a profound sense of impending doom filled every corner of her thoughts. The car continued closing the distance rapidly with no indication of slowing down or changing course. At that critical and life-threatening moment on the brink of disaster, CEO Quan suddenly appeared from the sidewalk area nearby. He rushed forward with urgent speed and fierce determination, moving like a flash through the darkness in an effort to reach her. At that critical and life-threatening moment on the brink of disaster, when the black vehicle was mere seconds away from impact, CEO Quan suddenly appeared from the sidewalk area nearby. He rushed forward with urgent speed and fierce determination, moving like a flash of light through the darkness in a desperate effort to reach her. In one swift and protective motion, he wrapped his strong arms tightly around Tu Tieu, pulling her close and turning his own body to shield her completely from the oncoming danger. The black car slammed into him with brutal, unforgiving force instead of hitting her. The impact created a sickening, thunderous sound that echoed horrifically through the quiet night street. CEO Quan was thrown violently through the air by the collision, his body twisting before crashing hard onto the cold, unforgiving pavement below. Blood immediately began flowing from a deep wound on his head, forming a dark, spreading pool that glistened under the harsh glow of the streetlights. The vehicle showed no signs of stopping or slowing down. It accelerated away quickly, its tires screeching as it disappeared into the darkness of the night, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning rubber and an atmosphere filled with sudden chaos. The entire street erupted into complete disorder within mere seconds. Voices of alarm and panic rose sharply from people who had witnessed the horrifying event nearby. Car horns blared urgently in the distance, and frantic calls for emergency assistance began filling the night air. Tu Lac stood completely still in stunned disbelief for a brief moment, her mind struggling desperately to process the terrifying scene she had just witnessed unfold before her eyes. CEO Quan had thrown himself into harm's way without any hesitation, sacrificing his own safety to save her life, and now he lay severely injured and motionless on the hard ground. The sight of his twisted body and the growing pool of blood around him sent powerful waves of shock, terror, and overwhelming guilt surging through her entire being. Before she could even gather her senses and move toward him, Trin stepped out from another car that had been parked close by. Her facial expression showed clear signs of intense anger and hidden tension as she approached with quick, purposeful steps across the street. Without any warning or hesitation, Trin raised her hand and delivered a sharp, forceful slap directly across Tu Lac's face. The strength of the blow was shocking, causing Tu Lac to stumble backward unsteadily before her knees gave way, and she fell onto the cold street surface. A burning, stinging pain spread rapidly across her cheek, mixing painfully with overwhelming feelings of shock, humiliation, emotional hurt, and confusion. Trin directed harsh and accusatory words at Tu Lac, claiming that she was the primary reason CEO Quan had ended up in this dangerous and critical condition. She described Tu Lac as a heavy burden and a damaging presence in CEO Quan's life, speaking with visible resentment, frustration, and deep-seated anger. These cutting statements struck Tu Lac deeply as she remained seated on the ground, tears beginning to flow freely and uncontrollably down her face while she instinctively touched the painful, reddened area on her cheek. A turbulent and overwhelming mix of confusion, heartbreak, disbelief, and emotional devastation coursed through her entire body, especially intensified by the fact that Trin had appeared at the exact moment of the accident, almost as if she had been waiting and watching from nearby all along. Even while suffering from serious and painful injuries, CEO Quan made a visible and painful effort to move slightly on the ground. With tremendous difficulty and obvious strain, he extended one trembling, bloodied hand slowly toward Tu Lac. His weakened and hoarse voice carried a message urging her to trust him, affirming that he only loved her and her alone, and explaining that everything else had simply been a misunderstanding. Shortly after expressing these heartfelt thoughts with great effort, his remaining strength completely failed him. He collapsed fully into unconsciousness, his body settling deeper into the pool of blood that continued to expand slowly beneath him on the street surface. Tu Lac released a raw, heart-wrenching cry filled with pure anguish and despair as she crawled desperately across the ground to his side. She pulled his motionless and injured form into her arms with great care, cradling him gently against her body as her unsteady and shaking hands worked frantically to wipe the blood from his face. Her fingers trembled uncontrollably with a combination of intense fear, love, and emotional exhaustion. The surrounding street had now transformed into a complete scene of chaos and urgency, with the distant sounds of approaching emergency sirens growing louder by the moment and a crowd of concerned onlookers beginning to gather around the tragic scene. Trin remained visible nearby for a short period, her previous expression of sharp anger gradually shifting into visible paleness and uncertainty. She took several unsteady steps backward, as if the full weight and reality of the violent situation was finally beginning to sink in for her as well. In Tu Lac's completely overwhelmed and racing mind, the same urgent and unanswered questions kept repeating endlessly without any resolution. She wondered desperately about the identity of the driver who had operated the black car that had targeted her so deliberately and with such deadly intent. She also struggled intensely to understand why Trin had appeared so precisely and conveniently at that critical and dangerous moment, as if she held some connection to the entire incident. She held CEO Quan's unconscious body even tighter in her arms, allowing her warm tears to fall steadily and continuously onto him, as her heart fractured painfully under the intense and conflicting pressures of profound love and overwhelming, paralyzing fear. The deep uncertainty about whether he would survive his severe injuries and whether she could find the inner courage and strength to trust him again amid all the growing suspicions, hidden dangers, and potential conspiracies left her feeling utterly broken, lost, and emotionally devastated in that chaotic moment on the cold street. This dramatic and violent event marked a significant and unforgettable turning point in Tu Lac's emotional journey. The selfless act of sacrifice from CEO Quan highlighted the apparent depth of his feelings and commitment toward her, yet it simultaneously raised even more troubling questions about the mysterious forces seemingly working against them both. The combination of sudden physical pain, visible loyalty, shocking violence, and lingering mysteries created a powerful and overwhelming storm of emotions that continued to swirl intensely around Tu Lac. She remained kneeling there on the street, clinging desperately to the man she loved, while the world around her moved in a disorienting blur of flashing lights, raised voices, and general confusion. The night that had originally begun with a simple search for truth had now spiraled into a full nightmare, filled with life-threatening danger, physical injury, and profound emotional devastation. As the first emergency service vehicles finally arrived on the scene, their flashing red and blue lights illuminated the tragic aftermath in harsh, dramatic patterns across the pavement and surrounding buildings. Tu Lac refused to release her hold on CEO Quan even as help approached, her mind racing frantically through every detail of what had just occurred. The sharp sting from Trine's slap still burned on her face, but the much deeper and more lasting pain came from the heavy uncertainty and paralyzing fear for CEO Quan's life and their shared future. She whispered silent prayers and words of encouragement for his survival, while continuing to hold him close, feeling the immense weight of all the unresolved issues, secrets, and threats pressing down heavily upon her shoulders. The possible connection between the anonymous threatening messages, the deliberate car attack, and Trine's suspiciously timed presence created a complicated and troubling web of suspicion that made it extremely difficult for her to think clearly or rationally in the midst of the crisis. The love she continued to feel for CEO Quan remained strong and unwavering even in this moment of extreme crisis, but it was now deeply mixed with new and painful layers of doubt, fear, and emotional exhaustion. Would he eventually wake up and provide the explanation she so desperately needed? Could she truly believe his words of love and reassurance after experiencing so many complications, misunderstandings, and dangers? The night air around them felt increasingly colder as she waited anxiously for medical help to arrive, her tears mixing with the bloodstains on his clothes. This single, terrifying moment on the ordinary city street had dramatically changed everything in their lives, pushing both their relationship and her own emotional and mental strength to the absolute breaking point. The story of Tu Lac and the challenges she faced was clearly far from over, with even more difficult revelations, emotional trials, and unexpected developments waiting ahead in the days to come. Tu Lac is drowning in heartbreak when she receives a mysterious message promising the truth about CEO Quan and Trine. Against her better judgment, she goes alone to Cafe Song Hong. While waiting, another message directs her to cross the street. In a terrifying moment, a black car speeds straight toward her. Just as death seems certain, CEO Quan appears out of nowhere, heroically throwing himself in front of her and taking the full impact. Severely injured and bleeding, he still manages to confess his love, insisting everything is a misunderstanding before losing consciousness. Suddenly, Trine emerges, furiously slapping Tu Lac and calling her a burden and a stain on CEO Quan's life. Amid the chaos and flashing sirens, Tu Lac holds CEO Quan's bloody body, tears streaming down her face, tormented by burning questions. Who tried to kill her? And why was Trin there at the exact moment? A story of love, sacrifice, betrayal, and deadly secrets.